She lost her husband while pregnant. What she did next will break and heal your heart. Welcome back and enjoy the story. In a picturesque coastal village where the ocean breeze carries whispers of both joy and sorrow, a 35-year-old pastry chef's life shatters one stormy morning. Flora, 6 months pregnant with her first child, receives the devastating news that her beloved husband's fishing boat was caught in a violent storm. The search teams return with only his wedding ring and a tattered jacket. Her world collapses as she faces an unimaginable reality, raising their child alone while her heart breaks into 1,000 pieces. The morning had begun like any other in Montauk, with the golden sunrise painting the harbor in warm hues as fishermen prepared their vessels for the day's catch. Flora had kissed David goodbye at the door of their small cottage, her rounded belly pressing between them as they embraced. "Be careful out there," she had whispered as she did every morning, a ritual born from the respect all fishermen's wives held for the unpredictable sea. David had smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and placed his weathered hand on her stomach. "Always am, taking care of all my treasures," he'd replied. Hours later, when the sky darkened without warning and violent waves began battering the shoreline, Flora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. She stood at their kitchen window, watching the storm rage, her hands kneading dough mechanically, while her mind was far away on the churning waters. The knock on her door came as the worst of the storm subsided, but before the search boats had even returned. She knew what it meant before she even opened the door to find the harbor master and sheriff standing solemnly on her porch, their faces grave beneath dripping rain gear. "We found debris from the mariner's lady," the harbor master said, his voice cracking as he held out a plastic bag containing David's wedding ring and the torn remains of his favorite jacket. The search continues, but with waves that size and the water temperature, Flora's legs gave way beneath her. The weight of her unborn child seemed suddenly unbearable as she collapsed into the sheriff's arms, a primal keening sound escaping her throat. She registered vague snippets of their voices. No survivors spotted, continuing at first light, miracle if anyone made it, but they were just sounds washing over her, meaningless against the roaring in her ears. The days that followed blurred into a nightmare from which Flora couldn't awaken. Search teams combed the coastline for miles in both directions. Coast Guard helicopters swept the waters where David's boat was last seen. Community members organized volunteer search parties, walking the beaches and rocky outcroppings. But after a week, even the most optimistic voices grew quiet. The sea, as it had done countless times throughout Montauk's history, had claimed another of its own. Flora moved through the funeral preparations like a ghost. She selected a casket that would remain empty, nodded at suggestions for the service, and stood stoically as friends and neighbors filed past to offer condolences. Inside she felt nothing but the persistent movements of her child, the tiny flutters and kicks a cruel reminder that life somehow continued even as her world had stopped turning. "He would have been such a wonderful father," whispered an elderly neighbor, squeezing Flora's hand. The simple truth of those words, the recognition of all that had been stolen from both her and her unborn child, finally cracked the numbshell surrounding Flora's heart. She excused herself from the receiving line and locked herself in the church bathroom, sliding down the wall as sobs racked her body. She cried for David, for the child who would never know its father, for the future they had planned so meticulously, that had vanished like morning mist over the harbor. The villagers, though sympathetic, whispered behind her back that the sea had claimed another victim, as it has done for generations in this fishing community. Flora, overwhelmed with grief, struggles to get out of bed for weeks. Her pastry shop, once filled with the sweet aroma of her famous cinnamon rolls, remains closed, and bills begin to pile up. The baby inside her is the only reason she forces herself to eat and take prenatal vitamins. The Little Stone Bakery, as Flora's shop was affectionately known in town, sat dark and shuttered on Montauk's main street. The cheerful blue door that had welcomed locals and summer tourists alike for the past 5 years remained locked, its window bearing a hastily scrawled sign, "Closed until further notice." Inside, Display cases gathered dust where they had once showcased Flora's artisanal breads and famous pastries. The first week after the funeral, Flora's best friend Gina used her spare key to clean out the perishables and cancel pending orders. The second week, she forwarded Flora's mail to the cottage, wincing at the stack of bills and vendor notices, accumulating. By the third week, whispers began circulating through town about whether the Little Stone Bakery would ever reopen. "Such a shame," said Mrs. Henderson, as she settled for a factory-made muffin at the diner instead. David was the love of her life, but that business was her passion. "The sea giveth, and the sea taketh away," intoned old Joe, who had lost his own father and brother to the waters decades ago. Some women never recover from that kind of loss, seen it happen time and again in these parts. Meanwhile, Flora alternated between her bed and the nursery she and David had been preparing. She would sit for hours in the rocking chair they had restored together, staring blankly at the half-finished ocean mural he had been painting on the wall. Gentle waves, playful dolphins, and a lighthouse beacon shining across the expanse. Sometimes, she talked to the baby, but more often she remained silent, conserving what little energy she had to force down vitamin-fortified smoothies Gina brought daily. Her mother-in-law, Ursula, bitter from her own loss, blames Flora for encouraging her son to go fishing that day instead of taking a day off. This creates a painful rift between them, leaving Flora without the support of the person who should understand her pain the most. The community's traditional mourning rituals, which Flora finds suffocating, only deepen her isolation as she refuses to wear the black clothing expected of widows in the village. "If you had asked him to stay home, just that once he would be alive today," Ursula had said during one particularly tense visit, her grief making her cruel. "You knew the forecast was questionable. Any responsible wife would have insisted." The accusation had cut deeper than Ursula could know. Flora had, in fact, suggested David take the day off after hearing the early morning weather report. But the fleet had been plagued by poor catches that month, and with a baby on the way, David couldn't afford to miss a day that might bring the haul they needed to stay afloat financially. "The baby deserved a father," Ursula continued, running her hand along the crib David had built. "Now all it will have are stories." Flora had asked her to leave then, one hand protectively covering her belly as if to shield the baby from its grandmother's bitterness. That evening, when Montauk's traditional fishing community delivered the mourning shawl that widows were expected to wear for the first year after losing their husbands to the sea, Flora had politely but firmly declined. "I understand its tradition," she told Mrs. Kowalski, who had brought the black garment wrapped in tissue paper, "but I won't drape my baby's world in darkness before it's even begun." The rejection of this centuries-old tradition raised eyebrows throughout the tight-knit fishing families. At Sunday services, Flora felt their stares as she entered the church wearing a simple navy dress rather than the expected black attire. The older women clicked their tongues. The men looked away uncomfortably. "Flora is turning her back on who we are," she overheard someone whisper in the grocery store one afternoon. "David was fourth-generation Montauk fishing family. The traditions honor his sacrifice." But Flora couldn't bring herself to care about their judgments. The weight of her grief was heavy enough, without adding the burden of a community's expectations. Instead, she poured what little energy she had into preparing for her child's arrival, washing tiny clothes and reading pregnancy books with mechanical determination. When Ursula declined to attend the baby shower Gina insisted on hosting, Flora felt both hurt and relief, one less relationship to navigate through the fog of her bereavement. As her due date approached, Flora's doctor expressed concern about her weight loss and emotional state. "Depression can affect the baby," Dr. Patel warned during a checkup. "Have you considered grief counseling?" Flora had nodded numbly, accepting the referral card but knowing she wouldn't call. How could a stranger help her navigate a pain so vast and consuming? Instead, she began forcing herself to eat regular meals and take short walks along the shore, away from the prying eyes of townspeople. Sometimes she spoke to David as if he were walking beside her, telling him about doctor appointments and the baby's latest movements. "I don't know how to do this without you," she confessed to the waves one evening, as the sunset painted the water the same fiery red as David's beard had been. I don't know how to be a mother when I can barely be a person right now. The sea had no answers for her, only the constant rhythmic reminder that the world continued turning despite her loss. But something about its endless movement began to seep into Flora's consciousness during these walks, a realization that she too would need to find a way to keep moving forward, for the sake of the child who would soon depend entirely on her. If you are enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you. Continuing. 3 months pass, and Flora gives birth to a beautiful baby girl, whom she names Nanette, after the sea that both gave and took away what she loved most. Holding her daughter for the first time, Flora experiences a profound moment of clarity. She will not allow tragedy to define either of their lives. With renewed determination, she reopens her pastry shop with Nanette sleeping in a bassinet behind the counter. The delivery room had been bright and sterile, a stark contrast to the darkness Flora had been living in for months. After 14 hours of labor, when the nurse placed the screaming, red-faced infant on her chest, something shifted in Flora's universe. The tiny being, with a wisp of copper hair so like her father's, blinked up with unfocused blue eyes, and Flora felt a surge of fierce protectiveness, unlike anything she had ever experienced. "Hello, Nanette," she whispered, the name she and David had chosen together slipping easily from her lips. They had selected it for David's grandmother, who had come to America from France with nothing but her family recipes and a determination to build a new life. But now the name held new meaning, derived from Nan, a variation of Anne meaning grace, and Ette, little one. A little grace. And wasn't that exactly what this child was? A small mercy in an unmerciful world. The hospital room had filled with flowers and well-wishers, though noticeably absent was Ursula, who sent a hand-knitted blanket with a neighbor rather than coming herself. Flora found she didn't mind. The joy of Nanette's arrival was too pure to be tainted by lingering resentments or old wounds. During those first few weeks at home, as Flora navigated the fog of new motherhood compounded by grief, she found herself studying her daughter's features for traces of David. There, in the shape of her nose, there in the stubborn set of her chin when she was hungry, there in the way her eyebrows furrowed in concentration as she nursed. David wasn't gone, not entirely. He lived on in their daughter. This realization became Flora's anchor. On Nanette's 1-month birthday, she woke before dawn and felt for the first time since the storm a sense of purpose stronger than her grief. While Nanette slept, Flora opened her recipe journal and began to plan. The grand reopening of the Little Stone Bakery was modest by any standard. Flora had spent several nights deep cleaning the space, wiping away months of dust and stale memories. She simplified her menu to focus on items she could prepare while caring for an infant. Hearty breakfast pastries, rustic breads, and a few signature cookies. The old playpen from Flora's own childhood was set up in the back office, visible from the kitchen and front counter. As Flora unlocked the blue door at 6 a.m. and flipped the sign to open, her hands trembled slightly. The pre-dawn air felt different on her skin now, full of possibility rather than dread. She had survived the darkest night of her soul. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they couldn't possibly be harder than what she had already endured. The first. Few customers are hesitant, unsure how to interact with the new mother, whose loss still hangs heavy in the air. Sales are dismal, and Flora barely makes enough to cover basic expenses. The bank sends a notice that her late husband's fishing boat loan is overdue, threatening to repossess their modest home. In desperation, Flora creates a new pastry inspired by her husband's favorite ingredients, sea salt, caramel, and dark chocolate. She calls it the Mariner and places it in her display window with no expectations. "Oh, you're open," stammered Mrs. Collins, the elementary school secretary, when she pushed open the door to find Flora arranging muffins in the display case. "I was just checking if, that is, we've missed your cranberry scones at the faculty meetings." The awkward dance continued all morning. Old customers entered with surprised expressions that quickly morphed into uncomfortable sympathy when they spotted Nanette sleeping in her bassinet. They ordered in hushed voices, as if in a hospital room, and left larger tips than necessary, avoiding Flora's eyes as they mumbled about being glad she was back. By closing time, Flora had sold less than half her inventory, far below what she needed to make the day profitable. She wrapped the remaining pastries to donate to the senior center, just as she had done in the old days, trying not to calculate the cost of ingredients wasted. "It'll get better," Gina assured her, helping to clean up while bouncing a fussy Nanette on her hip. "People just don't know what to say yet. They'll get over it." But the following days showed only marginal improvement. Many of Flora's wholesale accounts had found other suppliers during her absence. The summer tourist season was winding down, taking with it the casual foot traffic that had once sustained the bakery through leaner winter months. Meanwhile, the bills continued to arrive with unrelenting regularity. The worst came 3 weeks after reopening, a formal notice from Coastal Maritime Credit Union regarding the outstanding loan on David's fishing boat, the Mariner's Lady. The boat had been recovered eventually, damaged but salvageable, and now sat in the harbor unused, a painful reminder of all Flora had lost. The loan had been in David's name, but as his widow, the debt had transferred to Flora. "We regret to inform you that your account is now 120 days past due," the letter stated clinically. "If payment arrangements are not made within 30 days, the credit union will be forced to repossess the collateral property, including the vessel Mariner's Lady, and the residential property at 247 Harbor View Lane." Flora read the letter 3 times, her hands growing colder with each pass. They could take not just the boat but her home, the cottage where she and David had built their life, where she had planned to raise Nanette surrounded by memories of her father. That night, after putting Nanette to bed, Flora sat at her kitchen table with her recipe journal open, desperation fueling a creative energy she hadn't felt in months. If the bakery was going to survive, if she was going to keep her home, she needed something spectacular, something uniquely hers that would draw customers back through her doors. The answer came as she flipped through the pages of recipes she and David had enjoyed together over the years. He had always favored bold combinations, sweet with salty, crunchy with creamy. His favorite treat had been the chocolate-dipped caramels she made every Christmas, finished with a sprinkle of sea salt harvested from Montauk shores. By morning, Flora had developed a concept for a new pastry, a buttery, flaky base layered with dark chocolate ganache, topped with salted caramel, and finished with a delicate shortbread crumble infused with local sea salt. She called it the Mariner, and spent the day perfecting the recipe, testing variations until she achieved the perfect balance of flavors, something bold yet comforting, complex yet familiar. When she placed the first batch in her display window the following morning, arranged on her best ceramic platter with a small hand-lettered sign, Flora had no grand expectations. It was simply one last effort, a tribute to David and a desperate attempt to save what remained of their shared dreams. To her surprise, a food blogger passing through the village tries the pastry and posts about it online, calling it a taste of the sea and sky wrapped in buttery comfort. Orders begin to pour in, not just from locals, but from neighboring towns. Flora can barely keep up with the demand. This sudden success draws the attention of her husband's former fishing partner, who reveals a shocking truth. Her husband had been planning to sell his boat to invest in expanding her pastry shop, believing in her talent more than she ever did herself. The young woman had wandered into the bakery just before closing, her camera hanging around her neck and a notebook tucked under her arm. "Mind if I grab something sweet before you shut down?" she'd asked, studying the nearly empty display case with interest. "I've been photographing the lighthouse all day and completely forgot to eat lunch." Flora, already counting the day's meager earnings, had gestured toward the few remaining items. "Take your pick. Everything's half price this late in the day." The woman's eyes had settled on the Mariner, the last one remaining from the morning's batch. "What's that one? It looks interesting." "It's new," Flora explained, suddenly self-conscious. "Dark chocolate, caramel and sea salt on a shortbread base. I call it the Mariner." Something in her tone must have conveyed the pastry's significance, because the woman's expression softened. "I'd love to try it," she said, adding with a smile, "I actually write a food blog focused on coastal towns. I'm working my way up the eastern seaboard this summer." Flora had wrapped the pastry carefully, watching as the woman took it to a corner table and began photographing it from various angles before taking a bite. The quiet moan of appreciation that followed was genuine, enough to bring a flush of pride to Flora's cheeks. "This is incredible," the blogger had exclaimed, already typing notes on her phone. "The way the salt cuts through the sweetness, and that hint of, is that nutmeg in the caramel? It's like a taste of the sea and sky wrapped in buttery comfort. Do you mind if I feature this in today's post?" Flora had agreed without much thought, assuming the blog had a small following at best. She'd even sent the woman home with a box of 6 more mariners for research purposes, just grateful someone had appreciated her creation. 3 days later, Flora arrived at the bakery to find a line extending down the sidewalk. "We saw it. On Coastal Cravings," explained the first customer, showing Flora the blog post on her phone. The beautifully composed photo of the mariner had garnered thousands of likes, and the writer's evocative description had apparently resonated with followers across the region. She said it was worth driving an hour for, and we had to see for ourselves. By noon, Flora had sold out of everything in the shop, including 3 full batches of the mariner. She closed early to prepare more dough, calling Gina for emergency childcare assistance. The following day brought even more customers, including a reporter from the regional newspaper and a buyer from a gourmet food shop in East Hampton who wanted to discuss wholesale opportunities. Within a week, Flora had hired 2 part-time assistants and expanded her hours. The Little Stone Bakery was not just back in business. It was thriving beyond anything she had experienced before. The emotional whiplash was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I can't believe this is happening," she confessed to Gina as they closed up shop late one evening, Nanette sleeping peacefully in her carrier. "Last week I was facing foreclosure, and now I'm turning away wholesale accounts because I can't keep up with the demand." "David would be over the moon," Gina said, hugging her friend. "He always said you were the most talented baker on the entire East Coast." The mention of David brought the customary pang, but it was accompanied now by something new, a bittersweet pride that she was building something he would have celebrated. The following morning, as Flora arrived to begin the day's baking at 4 a.m., she was surprised to find Jack Murphy, David's former fishing partner, waiting by the back door. They hadn't spoken since the funeral, their shared grief too raw for casual conversation. "Got a minute?" he asked, looking uncomfortable in his clean flannel shirt, clearly dressed for an occasion other than fishing. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." Over coffee at the workstation while Flora's dough rested, Jack revealed the truth that had been weighing on him for months. "David was planning to sell the Mariner's Lady," he said, staring into his mug. "That's why he was so determined to get out that day despite the forecast. He had a buyer lined up, a corporate fishing outfit expanding their fleet. The money wasn't great, but it would have been enough." Flora set down the rolling pin she'd been absently turning in her hands. "Enough for what?" Jack finally met her eyes. "For the bakery expansion you'd been talking about. He showed me the plans one night on the boat. You wanted to add a cafe section, right? With seating and a bigger kitchen?" Flora's breath caught. She and David had indeed discussed expanding the bakery, but it had always been framed as a someday dream, not an immediate goal. The idea that he had been secretly working to make it happen, that he had been willing to sell his beloved boat, his family legacy, struck her with the force of a physical blow. "He believed in you, Flora," Jack continued, his voice gruff, with emotion. "Said you had more talent in your little finger than most fancy chefs had in their whole bodies. He was convinced this place could be something special, something bigger than just a local bakery." As Jack left, pressing a weathered envelope into her hands that contained the buyer's information, "In case you still want to sell the boat," Flora felt a shift in her understanding of both her past and her future. David hadn't just loved her, he had believed in her vision, enough to sacrifice his own family tradition to help her achieve it. The knowledge was both heartbreaking and fortifying. That night, as orders for the Mariner continued to arrive, by phone and email, Flora spread David's expansion sketches across their kitchen table and allowed herself for the first time to imagine a future built on the foundation of his faith in her. As the bittersweet dawn of early October painted the harbor in mellow light, Flora returned to her small but thriving bakery with a renewed sense of purpose. The Mariner had become more than a pastry. It was the bridge between her past and her future, between loss and possibility. During a particularly busy morning, Flora discovers an old recipe book of her husband's grandmother, filled with traditional sea-inspired desserts that had been forgotten over generations. As she experiments with these recipes, adding her own modern twist, the shop's popularity grows even more. A local hotel owner offers to feature her pastries at their breakfast buffet, providing a steady income stream. For the first time since her loss, Flora begins to feel financial stability. The morning rush had become a blur of familiar faces and the constant ring of the cash register. Flora moved on autopilot between the kitchen and front counter, her hands remembering their craft even as her mind juggled customer orders, ingredient inventories, and the occasional glance at Nanette, now 4 months old and captivated by the ceiling fan from her playpen in the corner. It was during one such frantic morning that Ursula appeared at the bakery for the first time since Nanette's birth. The older woman stood awkwardly at the counter, out of place among the weekend tourists and regular customers. "I heard about your success," she said stiffly when Flora finally had a moment free. "Thought I should see for myself." Flora handed her mother-in-law a Mariner on the house, watching cautiously as the woman took a careful bite. Something flickered across Ursula's weathered face, recognition perhaps, or memory. "David always did love salt with his chocolate," she said finally, her voice softening slightly. Then, reaching into her large handbag, she withdrew a battered, leather-bound book. "Found this while cleaning out some old boxes. Thought you might want it for the little one someday, family history and all that." The book was heavy in Flora's hands, its cover worn smooth by generations of use. "What is it?" she asked, running her fingers over the faded gold lettering that had once spelled out recettes in elegant script. "My mother-in-law's recipe book, David's grandmother. She brought it over from the old country when she married into the Murphy fishing clan. Used to make the most remarkable desserts for the fleet celebrations." The unexpected gift left Flora speechless. She had heard stories of the legendary Grandma Murphy and her French pastry skills, but had assumed those culinary traditions died with her decades ago. That night, after closing and putting Nanette to bed, Flora carefully turned the fragile pages of the old recipe book. Written in a combination of French and English, with occasional notes in what must have been Grandma Murphy's native Breton, the recipes revealed a fascinating tradition of sea-inspired desserts created to honor the fishing community's relationship with the ocean. There were tide cookies that changed flavor from one end to the other, mimicking the changing salinity of the estuary where fresh water met sea. Storm cloud meringues incorporated edible charcoal for dramatic effect. Fisherman's prayer bread included ingredients meant to ensure safe return, sea salt for preservation, honey for sweetness in hard times, and caraway for protection. Most intriguing were the widow's comfort tarts, small pastries developed specifically to sustain women who had lost their husbands to the sea. The recipe included ingredients known for their calming properties, lavender, chamomile, honey, wrapped in a sturdy crust that would keep without spoiling through the darkest days of mourning. Flora felt a connection stretching across generations of women who had faced the same loss she had endured, who had found ways to nourish themselves and their children despite their grief. With growing excitement, she began experimenting with these traditional recipes, updating them with modern techniques and local seasonal ingredients. The Tide cookies became a weekend special, reimagined with a gradient of flavor from sweet vanilla bean to salted caramel. The Storm Cloud meringues, now made with activated charcoal and topped with lightning bolts of crystallized ginger, became an Instagram sensation when placed in the window during the next coastal storm. Most successful was Flora's interpretation of the Widow's Comfort tarts, which she renamed Solace tarts and filled with lavender honey custard and local blueberries. Their popularity rivaled even the Mariner, particularly among female customers who seemed to intuitively understand their purpose without explanation. As word spread about the unique heritage desserts, journalists from food magazines began making pilgrimages to the bakery. A feature in Coastal Living highlighted the story of these rediscovered recipes and the young widow who had given them new life, complete with photographs of Flora and Nanette in the kitchen, the ancient recipe book, open beside them. It was this article that caught the attention of James Reynolds, owner of the newly renovated Montauk Harbor Hotel. He arrived at the bakery one afternoon just as Flora was closing, his chauffeur waiting in an idling luxury SUV outside. "Mrs. Murphy," he began, extending his hand after introducing himself, "I've just opened a boutique hotel on the North Shore, and I believe your pastries would be the perfect addition to our breakfast service." The business proposition was straightforward and generous. The hotel would feature a selection of Flora's pastries at their daily breakfast buffet, with guaranteed minimum orders regardless of occupancy rates. They would also feature the story of the historic recipes on their menu and in their promotional materials, giving the bakery valuable exposure to wealthy visitors from New York City and beyond. "We're positioning ourselves as a luxury property deeply connected to local traditions and craftsmanship," Reynolds explained. "Your story and these remarkable pastries fit perfectly with our brand narrative." For the first time since David's death, Flora found herself planning more than just day-to-day survival. The wholesale account would provide reliable income even during the off-season months when Montauk grew quiet. She hired 2 more assistants, including a young culinary school graduate who specialized in bread making, allowing Flora to focus on the heritage pastries that had become her signature. By November, as the town prepared for the quiet winter ahead, the Little Stone Bakery had transformed from a struggling small business to a thriving enterprise with multiple revenue streams. Flora opened a business account at the local bank, made arrangements to pay off the boat loan in full by spring, and even set aside a small college fund for Nanette. Financial stability brought with it a different kind of peace than Flora had expected. It wasn't happiness exactly. The grief of losing David remained a constant companion, but rather a sense of capability, of resilience. She was not just surviving, she was building something meaningful from the wreckage of her broken plans. "You're doing okay, aren't you?" Gina asked one evening as they shared tea after closing, Nanette babbling happily in her high chair. Flora considered the question carefully before answering. "I'm doing something," she said finally. "Something that matters. And for now, that's enough." The holidays loom ahead, the first Christmas without David casting a long shadow over Flora's newfound stability. But as she adapts her mother-in-law's recipes for the festive season, creating lighthouse lantern cookies that glow with candied citrus and safe harbor Yule logs, rich with warming spices, Flora discovers that the act of creation itself is healing. In each pastry, she finds a way to honor what she has lost while embracing what remains. As winter's chill settles over Montauk, will this young widow's courage to reimagine her life inspire others touched by grief to find their own path forward? Will the sweet legacy she's building provide not just financial security, but emotional sanctuary for herself and her daughter? As Nanette approaches her first birthday, Flora receives a letter from a prestigious culinary competition in the capital city. Someone has nominated her pastries, and she's been selected as a finalist. The competition would require her to leave the village for a week, something that terrifies her, as she hasn't spent a night away from home since the tragedy. Her mother-in-law, who has been watching Flora's determination from a distance, unexpectedly offers to care for Nanette during the competition, the first step toward healing their relationship. The envelope arrived on a bitter January morning, the official logo of the American Culinary Heritage Foundation embossed in gold on heavy cream stationery. Flora nearly discarded it with the junk mail, assuming it was a donation solicitation. Only a nagging curiosity prompted her to slice it open while waiting for her second batch of morning pastries to finish baking. "Dear Ms. Murphy," the letter began formally, "we are pleased to inform you that your establishment, the Little Stone Bakery, has been nominated for the Foundation's annual Heritage Preservation Award. in the category of Regional Pastry Arts. Flora read the letter 3 times before its significance fully registered. The American Culinary Heritage Foundation was the country's most prestigious culinary organization dedicated to preserving traditional American foodways. Their annual competition in Washington, D.C. drew participants from across the nation and was covered by major food publications and networks. According to the letter, an anonymous culinary professional had nominated Flora's revival of the Murphy family recipes as an outstanding example of preserving coastal culinary traditions. 10 finalists had been selected from hundreds of nominations, and Flora was among them. Finalists are required to attend the 5-day conference and competition in Washington, D.C., culminating in the awards banquet on February 15th, the letter continued. Participants will demonstrate their signature heritage recipes before a panel of judges and discuss the cultural significance of their culinary traditions. Flora's first instinct was to decline. The thought of leaving Montauk, leaving Nanette, for nearly a week seemed impossible. She hadn't spent a single night away from her daughter since her birth, hadn't traveled farther than the neighboring town of East Hampton in over a year. The idea of navigating airports, hotels, and the intimidating world of high-level culinary competitions alone left her feeling physically ill. Yet as the day progressed and she shared the news with Gina and her small staff, their enthusiasm made Flora reconsider. This wasn't just an honor for her. It was recognition for the entire Murphy family's culinary legacy, for generations of women who had created these recipes as acts of love and survival. "You have to go," insisted Gina, bouncing Nanette on her hip. "This is huge, Flora, the kind of exposure that could change everything for the bakery." "But Nanette, I could watch her for a couple of days," Gina offered, "but with the twins' school schedule, I couldn't manage the whole week." Flora nodded, knowing that even Gina's generosity had practical limits. Her friend was already juggling her own young children and part-time work. The logistics seemed insurmountable, and Flora had nearly convinced herself to send a polite letter of decline when Ursula Murphy appeared at her door that evening. Relations between Flora and her mother-in-law had warmed slightly since the gift of the recipe book, though their interactions remained cautious. Ursula occasionally stopped by the bakery for coffee, and Flora had begun sending home weekly care packages of pastries with Jack Murphy for his former mother-in-law. But they had not yet bridged the chasm of shared grief that still separated them. "I heard about the competition," Ursula said without preamble, as Flora invited her in from the cold. "Gina mentioned it when I ran into her at the market." Flora nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "It's a big honor, but I don't think I can manage it. Nanette is still so young, and I've never left her overnight." Ursula remained standing, her posture stiff but determined. "That's why I'm here. I'll watch her while you're gone." The offer hung in the air between them, unexpected and loaded with significance. Flora studied her mother-in-law's face, searching for any hint of resentment or obligation. "You don't have to do this," Flora said carefully. "I know things have been difficult between us." Ursula's expression softened slightly. "She's my son's daughter, and these recipes, they're part of her heritage too." She paused, then added more quietly, "David would have wanted you to go. He was always so proud of your talent." The mention of David, spoken not with accusation but with shared remembrance, brought unexpected tears to Flora's eyes. For the first time, she felt that perhaps Ursula's grief mirrored her own, different in shape but equal in depth. "Are you sure?" Flora asked. "I raised 3 boys in a fishing family," Ursula replied with a hint of her old wry humor. "I think I can handle one little girl for a few days. Besides, it's time Nanette and I got properly acquainted." And so the arrangements were made. Flora accepted the Foundation's invitation, prepared sample pastries for shipping ahead to Washington, and created detailed notes on Nanette's schedule and preferences. Though anxiety gnawed at her as the departure date approached, there was also a flutter of something that felt surprisingly like excitement, a reminder that she was still a person beyond her grief and motherhood, with ambitions and talents of her own. The culinary competition throws Flora into the spotlight, where she must face journalists who ask invasive questions about her inspirational widow's story rather than focusing on her culinary skills. Frustrated and ready to quit, she meets a kind restaurant consultant who recognizes her authentic talent and offers genuine advice without pity. Their professional relationship slowly evolves into friendship, giving Flora her first opportunity to laugh genuinely in over a year. Washington in February was colder than Flora had anticipated. The elegant hotel that hosted the competition a world away from her cozy bakery kitchen. The first day's orientation introduced her to the other finalists, established chefs from prestigious restaurants, cookbook authors, and culinary instructors. Flora, in her simple black dress and without professional credentials beyond her small-town bakery, felt immediately out of place. "And you're the young widow with the revived fishing community recipes, yes?" asked one of the judges during the reception, her voice dripping with sympathy. "Such a heartwarming story." Flora nodded politely, trying not to wince at being reduced to the young widow. Throughout the evening and into the next day's preliminary judging, she found herself fielding questions that seemed more interested in her personal tragedy than her culinary achievements. "How does it feel to carry on your husband's family tradition after his tragic accident?" asked a food blogger during the press session. "Do you think your daughter will follow in these traditions?" inquired another. "Would you say baking has been therapeutic in your grief journey?" questioned a magazine writer, looking at Flora with head tilted in practiced compassion. By the third day, as Flora prepared her signature Solace tarts for the semi-final round, her patience had worn dangerously thin. When a television crew asked her to look more emotional while describing the widow's comfort tarts that had inspired her creation, she nearly walked out. "These recipes aren't about grief," she told the startled interviewer. "They're about survival and creativity in connection to something larger than ourselves. That's what I'm here to share. Not my personal tragedy for your viewers' entertainment." The outburst earned her a reputation among the media as difficult, but it also caught the attention of Gabriel Harrison, a well-respected restaurant consultant who was serving as a technical advisor to the competition. He approached her that evening as she sat alone in the hotel bar, nursing a ginger ale and questioning her decision to attend at all. "Your lavender custard has the perfect consistency," he said without preamble, sliding onto the stool beside her. "Most people overdo the thickening agent when working with floral flavors, but you've balanced it perfectly." The simple professional observation, the first she'd received since arriving that focused solely on her craft, nearly brought Flora to tears. "Thank you," she managed. "It took a lot of trial and error. I can imagine. Lavender can turn soapy so easily." Gabriel introduced himself properly and ordered a club soda. "I've been consulting with heritage restaurants for 15 years, and I've rarely seen someone capture the essence of traditional recipes while making them entirely their own. It's a gift." They talked for 2 hours that night, discussing technique, ingredients, and the business challenges of marketing traditional foods to modern consumers. Not once did Gabriel mention David's death or ask about Flora's journey. He simply treated her as what she was, a talented baker with a unique culinary perspective. "The judges are impressed with your work," he told her as they wrapped up the conversation. "Don't let the media narratives distract you. You're here because of what you can create, not because of what you've lost." The following day, Flora approached the final round with renewed confidence. She presented her creation, a complex pastry called Harbor Lights that incorporated elements from several Murphy family recipes with technical precision and quiet pride. When asked about its significance, she spoke eloquently about the fishing community's culinary traditions and the women who had preserved them, without once mentioning her widow status. She finished second overall, earning the silver medal and a substantial cash prize. More valuable than the award, however, was the network of culinary professionals she connected with during the conference's final days. Several specialty food distributors expressed interest in carrying packaged versions of her heritage cookies, and a cookbook editor suggested she consider publishing the Murphy family recipes with her modern adaptations. Most significant was her continued conversation with Gabriel, who offered professional advice without the condescension or pity she'd grown accustomed to receiving. On the final evening, as they shared dinner in the hotel restaurant, Flora found herself laughing genuinely at his story about a disastrous truffle showcase in Italy, the first time she'd laughed without reservation since David's death. "You should do that more often," Gabriel observed. "Laugh, I mean, it suits you." "It feels strange," Flora admitted, "like I'm betraying something important by enjoying myself." Gabriel considered this thoughtfully. "Joy and grief aren't opponents in a zero-sum game," he said finally. "Having one doesn't diminish the other." The insight stayed with Flora throughout her journey home, a small light illuminating possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to consider. As the plane descended toward New York, she realized she was eager not just to see Nanette again, but to return to her kitchen and implement the techniques and ideas she'd gathered during the competition. For the first time, she was looking forward rather than backward. Not moving on from her loss, but moving forward with it as part of her story, rather than its entire plot. Flora returns to the village with the second-place prize and enough connections to start supplying her pastries to upscale establishments in the capital. As business grows, she converts her husband's old fishing boat into a floating cafe, honoring his memory while creating something new. This bold move divides the traditional village. Some see it as disrespectful, while others admire her innovation. The homecoming was sweeter than Flora had anticipated. Ursula had brought Nanette to the airport, and the sight of her daughter's face lighting up in recognition was worth every anxious moment away. Even more surprising was the ease that had developed between Flora and her mother-in-law, a tentative but growing comfort in each other's company. "She was perfect," Ursula reported as they drove back to Montauk. "Slept through the night twice. Has David's appetite, this one." News of Flora's success at the competition had preceded her return. The bakery windows had been decorated with congratulatory signs, and Gina had organized a small welcome reception with their closest friends. Even Jack Murphy stopped by with several of David's former crew members, their usual gruff demeanor softened by genuine pride in Flora's achievement. "Putting Montauk on the culinary map," Jack declared, raising his coffee mug in toast. "David would have gotten such a kick out of this." The mention of David in this context, as someone who would have celebrated her success rather than as a tragic absence, marked a subtle but significant shift in how the community framed Flora's story. She was no longer defined solely as a widow, but recognized as a craftsperson in her own right, carrying forward traditions while creating something distinctly her own. This evolution accelerated in the weeks that followed, as Flora implemented her plans for expansion. The connections she'd made in Washington opened doors to upscale establishments in New York City, Boston, and Washington itself. The Little Stone Bakery began shipping specialty cookie assortments to gourmet food shops and providing weekend pastry deliveries to boutique hotels along the coast. As winter yielded to spring, Flora's business continued to flourish, but a new challenge emerged. The harbor master informed her that the Mariner's Lady, still docked in its slip and carefully maintained by Jack out of respect for David, would need significant repairs to remain seaworthy. The annual inspection had revealed structural issues that would cost thousands to address. "I can't justify that expense for a boat that never leaves the harbor," Flora confessed to Ursula during one of their now regular Sunday dinners. "But I can't bring myself to sell it either. It feels like letting go of another piece of him." Ursula, who had been watching Nanette stack blocks on the living room floor, considered this dilemma. "David wasn't sentimental about boats," she said finally. "He used to say a vessel was only worth what you could do with it. If it can't fish anymore, maybe it's meant for something else." The idea took root in Flora's mind, germinating slowly over the following weeks as she observed the increasing foot traffic along the harbor during the early tourist season. Montauk had several fine restaurants, but nothing casual along the waterfront, where visitors could enjoy a quick breakfast or afternoon coffee while watching the fishing fleet come and go. What if the Mariner's Lady could serve a new purpose? The vessel's broad deck could accommodate several cafe tables. The cabin below could be converted to a small prep kitchen. With the proper permits and renovations, David's fishing boat could become a unique floating cafe featuring the heritage pastries that had brought Flora recognition. The concept was ambitious and not without significant challenges. Zoning ordinances, health department requirements, and maritime regulations all presented hurdles. The renovation costs would be substantial, but the more Flora researched, the more viable the idea became. It would be a way to honor David while creating something new, she explained to Gabriel during one of their weekly phone calls, which had continued after her return to Montauk. The boat would remain where it belongs, on the water, just serving a different purpose. Gabriel's enthusiasm confirmed what Flora already felt. This was the right direction. Heritage and innovation in perfect balance, he said. It's exactly what you do with your baking, applied to a larger concept. Not everyone shared this positive view. When Flora presented her plans to the harbor community during a town meeting, reactions were sharply divided. Many of the older fishing families saw the conversion of a working vessel into a tourist attraction as a betrayal of Montauk's maritime traditions. Fishing boats are for fishing, declared old Joe Henderson, whose family had worked these waters for 6 generations. Turning one into a floating coffee shop makes a mockery of the men who risk their lives out there every day. Others, particularly the younger business owners who recognized the importance of the tourist economy to Montauk's survival, were enthusiastic about the innovative concept. This kind of unique attraction is exactly what brings visitors back. Year after year, argued the owner of a local boutique hotel. It honors our fishing heritage while creating something fresh and appealing. The debate spread throughout the village, occasionally creating tense situations for Flora as she navigated grocery stores and school functions. Some old-timers who had been loyal customers stopped coming to the bakery in protest. Anonymous notes appeared on the shop door, accusing her of selling out and disrespecting David's memory. Most painful was Jack Murphy's reaction. David's former partner and friend had been increasingly supportive of Flora's bakery endeavors, but the boat conversion struck a nerve. That vessel was meant for the open water, for honest work, he told Flora when she sought his opinion. David's father took his first steps on that deck. 3 generations of Murphy men worked those nets, and now it's going to serve cappuccinos to summer people in Gucci sunglasses. His disapproval stung, but Flora remained convinced of her vision. The mariner's lady can't fish anymore, she reminded him gently, but she can still be part of this harbor, still support a Murphy family, just in a different way. Despite the controversy, Flora proceeded with her plans. The necessary permits were secured, renovations began, and by early summer, the transformation was complete. The mariner's lady, freshly painted in the same blue as the bakery door, but with its original name proudly displayed, was towed to a permanent mooring near the harbor walkway. Its fishing equipment had been respectfully preserved and incorporated into the decor, with old nets serving as artistic dividers between tables and authentic fishing floats reimagined as light fixtures. On opening day, Flora stood nervously. On the dock, Nanette balanced on her hip, unsure whether anyone would brave the social controversy to patronize the floating cafe. But as the morning sun rose over the harbor, a line began to form. First a few curious tourists, then several supportive friends, and finally, to Flora's surprise, a group of older fishermen led by none other than old Joe Henderson himself. "My Ellie wanted to try the place," he explained gruffly when Flora greeted him, referring to his wife of 50 years. "Said if I can spend my retirement sitting at the VFW drinking coffee and talking about the old days, I can do it here just as well." As the morning progressed, more villagers arrived, curiosity overcoming their initial resistance. By noon, every table was filled, and Flora's staff was scrambling to keep up with orders for the Mariner and other heritage pastries. The atmosphere was lively but respectful, with many customers taking time to read the small plaques Flora had installed describing the boat's history and the Murphy family's fishing legacy. Most meaningful was the arrival of Ursula in the late afternoon, bringing with her several elderly women from the fishing community, widows who had lost their own husbands to the sea decades earlier. They sat at the prime table Flora had reserved for them, sipping tea and sampling Solace tarts, while watching the afternoon light play across the harbor. "It's different," Ursula admitted when Flora joined them briefly. "But it's good different. You've given the old girl a new life, just like you've done for yourself." She looked around at the bustling cafe, then back at her granddaughter playing contentedly in a safe corner of the deck. David would have called it a fair trade, a fishing boat for all of this. The floating cafe quickly became one of Montauk's most popular attractions, written up in travel guides and featured on social media. More importantly, it began to heal the divide within the community, as locals found themselves enjoying the unique space that honored their traditions while embracing change. Jack Murphy never fully approved, but he grudgingly admitted that at least she's keeping it on the water where it belongs. For Flora, the Mariner's Lady Cafe represented something profound, the understanding that honoring the past didn't mean being imprisoned by it. Like the heritage recipes she had adapted for modern palates, the boat's transformation preserved what was valuable about Montauk's fishing tradition while creating something new and vital for its future. A severe storm hits the village, causing flooding in the lower section where her shop is located. The damages are extensive, and insurance will only cover a portion of the repairs. Just when Flora considers giving up, the villagers rally around her, offering their skills and resources for repairs. Even those who had judged her mourning choices now acknowledge her resilience and contribution to the community. The late August storm arrived with little warning, a tropical system that had been expected to remain offshore, but suddenly veered toward Long Island in the night. Flora woke to emergency alerts on her phone and the sound of rain hammering against her bedroom window with unnatural force. Her first thought was of the floating cafe, which, despite being designed to weather normal marine conditions, wasn't equipped for hurricane-force winds. Jack Murphy called before dawn. "Harbor Patrol is securing everything, but you should come down if you can," he said, the background filled with the sounds of shouting men and howling wind. "We're moving the lady to the protected marina on the north side." By the time Flora arranged emergency childcare with Ursula and made her way to the harbor, roads were already flooding. The Mariner's Lady had been safely relocated, but the main bakery, situated in the village's low-lying commercial district, was directly in the path of rising waters. Flora and her staff worked frantically to move equipment and inventory to higher shelves, but by mid-morning, water was seeping under the Tador East. They were forced to evacuate as emergency management officials closed the district, watching helplessly from higher ground as the storm surge transformed familiar streets into murky canals. The storm passed by evening, but its damage remained. When Flora was finally allowed to return to the bakery the following afternoon, the scene was devastating. Nearly 2 feet of water had inundated the shop, damaging walls, floors, and much of the custom equipment. Refrigeration units were ruined, electrical systems compromised, and much of her inventory, ingredients, packaging, specialty items destroyed. "I don't know if I can come back from this," she confessed to Gina as they surveyed the damage, the familiar scents of vanilla and cinnamon replaced by the sickly sweet smell of mildew and sea debris. "Insurance will only cover about 60% of the damages, and I've invested so much in the cafe expansion." The floating cafe had survived intact, but without the bakery production facility, Flora couldn't supply either location properly. For the first time since those dark days after David's death, she felt the crushing weight of defeat pressing against her chest, threatening to extinguish the resilience she had so carefully cultivated. That evening, as Flora sat at her kitchen table surrounded by sodden paperwork and insurance forms, a knock at the door revealed Jack Murphy, along with several other fishermen from the harbor. "Thought you could use some help with cleanup," Jack said simply, as if offering assistance to the woman who had converted a fishing boat to a cafe was the most natural thing in the world. "We know a thing or two about water damage." For Flora, who had weathered community disapproval to pursue her vision, this unexpected support breached her carefully maintained composure. "Why would you help me?" she asked, unable to keep the emotion from her voice. "Some of you haven't spoken to me in months." Old Joe Henderson, standing at the back of the group, cleared his throat. "Harbor folk take care of their own," he said, gruffly. "Your place brings joy to people. Way I see it, that's as important as bringing in fish." The next morning, a volunteer crew assembled at the bakery, not just fishermen but shopkeepers, teachers, and families from throughout Montauk. Someone had organized a work schedule, assigning teams to debris removal, sanitizing and basic repairs. A local contractor offered to coordinate the rebuilding at cost, and the high school shop teacher arrived with students who could help restore the custom cabinetry. Even more surprisingly, many of the traditional fishing wives who had once judged Flora's rejection of mourning customs arrived with food for the workers and offers to mind Nanette during cleanup. "We may be set in our ways," explained Mrs. Kowalski, who had once brought the rejected black shawl, "but we know strength when we see it. This town needs your business, and maybe we need your example too." For 3 weeks, the community effort continued. The bakery's structural repairs progressed rapidly under volunteer labor, with only specialized work requiring paid professionals. Local suppliers donated replacement ingredients and basic equipment. The owner of a neighboring town's commercial kitchen offered temporary production space so Flora could continue supplying the floating cafe, which had reopened just days after the storm. Most meaningful was the day Ursula arrived with a check, explaining awkwardly that she had sold some family jewelry. "David's great-grandmother's pearls," she said when Flora protested. "They've been sitting in a safe deposit box for decades. Better they should help rebuild something living than gather dust as a memento." The bakery reopened 6 weeks after the flood, its blue door freshly painted and its interior improved beyond its original state. The community celebration that marked the occasion felt different from anything Flora had experienced in Montauk before, not because of the food or decorations, but because of the profound sense of belonging that permeated the gathering. Standing among neighbors who had once whispered behind her back, but now embraced her as an essential part of their community, Flora realized how far she had come from those dark days after David's death. She had not only rebuilt her life, but had somehow, without intending to, helped reinvigorate Montauk's sense of itself, as a place that honored tradition while embracing the changes necessary for survival. When she shared this observation with Jack Murphy, as they watched Nanette toddling among the fishing family children, he nodded thoughtfully. "That's the thing about coastal towns," he said. "We talk about tradition, but the real tradition is adaptation. The sea changes, the weather changes, the fish move. Those who can't change get washed away." He glanced at Flora with newfound respect. "You've got good sea legs on you for a baker." The restaurant consultant visits to help Flora redesign the shop after the flood damage and reveals another surprise. A major food magazine wants to feature her story and recipes in their next issue. During the photo shoot, Flora takes Nanette, now walking and babbling, to the shore where she feels closest to her husband. A filmmaker capturing coastal traditions for a documentary spots them and asks to include their story, bringing national attention to the village and its rich maritime culture. Gabriel arrived in Montauk 2 months after the reopening, his first visit to the coastal village that had featured so prominently in their conversations. Flora watched his face as he took in the floating cafe, pleased by his evident appreciation of how she had honored the vessel's heritage while creating something entirely new. "The photographs didn't do it justice," he said, running his hand along a polished railing that had once secured fishing nets. "You can feel the history, but it's not a museum. It's alive." The real purpose of Gabriel's visit was to help Flora redesign the bakery's interior layout following the flood repairs. His expertise in restaurant flow and efficiency had proven invaluable during their phone consultations, but some decisions needed to be made in person. They spent 2 days rearranging equipment, optimizing workspaces, and creating a more engaging customer experience. On their final evening of planning, as they worked late at the bakery's central table, Gabriel revealed the additional purpose of his trip. "Culinary Heritage Monthly wants to feature you in their spring issue," he said, sliding a formal letter across the table. Cover story: Tradition Reimagined, How One Baker is Preserving Coastal Culinary History. Flora stared at the letterhead of America's most prestigious food magazine, momentarily speechless. How did this happen? "The editor was one of the judges at the competition," Gabriel explained. "She's been following your story, the cafe conversion, the community response after the flood. She thinks your approach to honoring heritage while embracing innovation represents exactly what modern American cuisine should be striving for. The magazine wanted not just an interview, but a substantive feature, including several of Flora's adapted recipes and professional photography of both the bakery and the floating cafe. The photo shoot was scheduled for the following month, when the publication's top food photographer would spend 2 days capturing Flora's creations and the unique environment she had developed. "This is the kind of exposure that changes careers," Gabriel said, his professional demeanor softening into genuine excitement for her. "It could open doors to a cookbook deal, television appearances, consulting opportunities, whatever direction you might want to explore." The prospect was both exhilarating and terrifying. Flora had never sought fame or recognition beyond her local community, had never imagined herself as a culinary personality representing traditions larger than her own experience. Yet she recognized that this platform could help preserve not just the Murphy family recipes, but an entire cultural heritage that might otherwise fade with changing times. "I'll do it," she decided, "but only if I can keep it authentic, no staged scenes or romanticized poverty. This is about real traditions created by real people, not some glossy fantasy of quaint coastal life." Gabriel smiled, unsurprised by her stipulation. "That's exactly why they want you, Flora. Authenticity can't be manufactured." The photo shoot in March exceeded Flora's expectations. The magazine's photographer, a woman named Layla with an uncanny ability to capture not just the appearance but the essence of food, spent hours shooting the mariner and other heritage pastries in natural light. She photographed Flora's hands preparing dough, focusing on the confidence of her movements rather than trying to create artificially perfect scenes. On the shoot's final day, Layla suggested capturing some images of Flora and Nanette in the village to provide context for the culinary story. With Nanette now walking confidently and babbling in near sentences, Flora took her to the small protected cove, where she had often gone to feel close to David. There was something about the particular quality of light there, the way the sun filtered through the sea mist, that had always reminded her of his smile. As Nanette collected shells along the shoreline, and Flora pointed out passing boats, Layla captured candid moments between mother and daughter against the backdrop of the working harbor. Neither of them noticed the man with a professional camera, who had begun filming from a respectful distance, seemingly focused on the fishing boats, but occasionally panning to include them in his shots. It wasn't until they were preparing to leave that he approached, introducing himself as Marcus Chen, a documentary filmmaker working on a series about vanishing American coastal traditions. "I'm recording the changing relationship between traditional fishing communities and the modern economy," he explained, showing Flora press credentials and a portfolio of his previous work. "When I saw you two on the shore, a young woman clearly connected to both worlds, it seemed like the perfect visual metaphor for what I'm trying to capture." Flora's initial wariness gave way to cautious interest as Marcus described his project, which sought to document not just the challenges facing traditional maritime communities, but the innovative ways they were adapting to preserve their cultural identity while embracing necessary change. "Your floating cafe is exactly the kind of adaptation I'm highlighting," he said, honoring the past without being trapped by it, creating something new that still respects tradition. After consulting with Gabriel, who vetted Marcus's reputation in the documentary world, Flora agreed to participate in a limited segment for the film. What began as a brief interview expanded into several days of filming at both the bakery and the cafe, capturing not just Flora's story, but the broader narrative of Montauk's evolution from fishing village to a community balancing traditional livelihoods with new economic opportunities. Marcus's approach was thoughtful and respectful, eschewing sensationalism in favor of nuanced storytelling. He interviewed old-timers like Joe Henderson about the changes they'd witnessed over decades, featured Jack Murphy explaining traditional fishing techniques, and filmed Ursula describing the culinary traditions that had sustained fishing families through lean seasons and personal tragedies. Most powerfully, he captured the community's collective response to the flood. Fishermen and shopkeepers working side by side to rebuild, traditional skills applied to modern challenges, ancient resilience channeled toward future sustainability. When the documentary aired on public television that fall, coinciding with the publication of the magazine feature, the response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Montauk found itself in the national spotlight, portrayed not as a quaint relic or a playground for the wealthy, but as a living, evolving community with deep roots and adaptive branches. Tourism increased, but it was a different kind of visitor who now sought out Montauk. People interested in authentic experiences, cultural heritage, and the unique foods that told the story of this place and its people. The floating cafe became a must-visit destination, and the bakery's mail-order business for heritage cookies and breads expanded to all 50 states. For Flora, the most meaningful outcome wasn't the commercial success, but the way the documentary and magazine feature had helped heal remaining divisions within the community. Seeing their town through outside eyes had given many longtime residents a renewed appreciation for both their traditions and the innovations that were helping those traditions survive in changing times. "You've given us a new way to see ourselves," the town supervisor told Flora during a community celebration of the documentary's success. Not stuck between past and future, but building a bridge between them. As Nanette turns 2, Flora uses her growing success to establish a scholarship fund for children in the village who want to pursue culinary arts or sustainable fishing practices. The fund's first ceremony is held on the restored boat, where Flora's mother-in-law presents the inaugural award, publicly acknowledging that her son would have been proud of what Flora created from their shared loss. Nanette's second birthday arrived with the burgeoning warmth of early May, a delicate spring day that seemed designed to celebrate new beginnings. Unlike her first birthday, marked by Flora's tentative steps back into community life, this milestone called for proper celebration. The floating cafe was decorated with balloons and streamers, and children from throughout the village were invited for cake and a harbor cruise on a friend's touring boat. Watching her daughter gleefully smearing frosting across her face, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had become like extended family, Flora felt a profound gratitude that contrasted sharply with the bleak despair of 2 years earlier. Nanette was thriving, a cheerful, curious toddler with David's auburn hair and determination, but Flora's thoughtful eyes and gentle manner with animals and smaller children. Most remarkably, she seemed to be growing up with a sense of belonging that transcended her father's absence. The village had embraced Nanette as their collective responsibility, with fishing families teaching her to identify different boats in the harbor, shopkeepers saving special treats for her visits, and older children including her in simplified versions of their games. It was during the birthday celebration that Flora announced the establishment of the David Murphy Memorial Scholarship Fund, an initiative she had been quietly developing for months. Using a portion of the proceeds from her expanding business, Flora had created an endowment to support young people from Montauk pursuing education in either culinary arts or sustainable fishing practices. "Two traditions that sustain this community," Flora explained to the gathered friends and family, "and two passions that defined David's life, his family's fishing heritage and his appreciation for food that tells the story of a place and its people." The scholarship would provide financial assistance for college or vocational training, internship stipends, and mentorship opportunities with established professionals in both fields. A committee comprising representatives from both the fishing and business communities would select recipients based on merit, need, and commitment to bringing their knowledge back to benefit Montauk. "This isn't charity," Flora emphasized when announcing the fund. "It's investment in our young people and in the future of traditions that make this place special. It's also simple recognition that pursuing these paths often requires leaving the village for education, which can be financially challenging for many families." The first scholarship ceremony was scheduled for June, timed to coincide with the harbor's annual blessing of the fleet, a tradition that had taken on renewed significance for Flora since establishing the floating cafe. The venue would be the Mariner's Lady itself, temporarily reconfigured to accommodate the presentation and a small reception afterward. As the day approached, Flora worked closely with Ursula to plan the details. Their relationship had evolved into a genuine partnership, the bitterness of early grief transformed into shared purpose and mutual respect. Ursula had become not just a loving grandmother to Nanette, but a valuable advisor to Flora, offering perspectives on fishing community, traditions that informed both the bakery's heritage recipes and the scholarship program's design. "You should present the first award," Flora suggested as they finalized arrangements. As the family's elder and keeper of so many traditions, Ursula initially demurred, unaccustomed to public speaking, but eventually agreed. "It would honor David's father as well," she acknowledged. "He always believed education was the key to keeping young people in the fishing life, making it a choice rather than a last resort." The day of the ceremony dawned clear and calm, the harbour a painter's palette of blues beneath an unblemished sky. The mariner's lady, freshly painted and festooned with flowers, drew admiring glances from passing boats as Flora's staff prepared for the afternoon event. Nanette, dressed in a sailor-inspired outfit that Ursula had sewn for the occasion, helped by earnestly carrying napkins from one table to another under Gina's watchful eye. The ceremony itself was brief but powerful. After Flora explained the scholarship's purpose and guidelines, Ursula took the microphone with uncharacteristic nervousness to present the inaugural award to Michael Castillo, a high school senior who planned to study sustainable fisheries management at the University of Rhode Island. "My son David believed in balance," Ursula began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Between honoring traditions and creating new paths forward, between respecting the sea's power and harnessing its gifts." She glanced at Flora and Nanette, then continued with clear emotion. "He would be proud of what his wife has created from our shared loss, a business that preserves our culinary heritage, a cafe that gives new life to a fishing vessel, and now this scholarship that will help young people like Michael carry our community's best traditions into the future." As she presented the certificate and check to the beaming young man, whose family had fished Montauk's waters for 3 generations, Ursula added a personal note that caused many in the audience to discreetly wipe away tears. "My son can't be here to see this, but I know he's watching from whatever harbour shelters him now, and his heart is full." The simple words, spoken by a woman who had once blamed Flora for her son's death, but now stood beside her in common purpose, represented healing of the deepest kind, not just between individuals but within the community itself. As the ceremony transitioned to celebration, with townspeople mingling on the boat deck enjoying Flora's pastries, the mood was one of collective pride and optimism. Gabriel, who had returned to Montauk for the ceremony, found Flora watching, the harbour activity from a quiet corner of the deck, Nanette napping against her shoulder after the excitement of the day. "You've created something remarkable here," he observed, gesturing not just to the cafe but to the gathering of diverse community members united in purpose, far beyond a business. Flora nodded, feeling the solid weight of her growing daughter and the gentle motion of the boat beneath her feet, dual reminders of stability amidst constant change. "I don't think I fully realized until today," she admitted. "It's not just about preserving traditions or even adapting them. It's about weaving them into something new that still carries the essence of what came before." The success of her business allows Flora to purchase the building next door to expand her operation. During renovations, workers discover a hidden cellar containing old fishing journals, including one belonging to her husband. Inside, she finds detailed sketches for a pastry shop design he had been working on secretly, revealing he had shared her dreams even more deeply than she knew. By the following spring, the Little Stone Bakery's growth had made its original space increasingly inadequate. Even with Gabriel's efficient redesign after the flood, Flora and her staff found themselves constantly navigating tight quarters. The wholesale accounts generated by the magazine feature and documentary had increased production demands beyond what the small bakery could reasonably accommodate. "You need to expand," Gabriel advised during one of his quarterly consulting visits. "Not just for current demand, but for what's coming. The holiday orders alone will exceed your capacity by at least 30%, based on last year's numbers." The solution presented itself unexpectedly when Mr. Hargrove, the elderly owner of the nautical gift shop next door, announced his retirement. His small building, originally constructed in the 1920s as part of Montauk's first commercial district, shared a wall with the Little Stone Bakery, and would allow for seamless expansion if the interior were properly renovated. Flora approached the bank with a solid business plan, backed by 2 years of impressive growth figures and projections developed with Gabriel's assistance. The loan was approved without hesitation, a far cry from her desperate situation when David's boat loan had threatened her home. By June, she had closed on the property and begun working with a local architect to design an expanded production facility that would connect to the original bakery while maintaining both buildings' historic character. The renovation began with selective demolition, carefully removing the non-structural portions of the shared wall to create flow between the spaces. It was during this process that the construction crew made a surprising discovery: a sealed door in the basement of the gift shop, hidden behind decades of shelving and storage cabinets. "Looks like some kind of old cellar," the foreman told Flora when he called her to the site. "Not on any of the building plans. Probably dates back to Prohibition, when these coastal towns were smuggling central." The heavy oak door, swollen with age and humidity, required substantial effort to open. Beyond it lay a small room with stone walls and a packed earth floor, illuminated only by the workers' flashlights. Metal shelving lined the walls, holding dozens of leather-bound books, glass bottles thick with dust, and various maritime implements whose purposes were not immediately apparent. "It's a fisherman's archive," explained Jack Murphy when Flora invited him to examine the discovery. Used to be common in harbour towns. Before weather reports and GPS, captains would record conditions, catches, navigation landmarks, information too valuable to lose if a man went down with his vessel. The journals dated back to the 1880s, chronicling the experiences of generations of Montauk fishermen. Some were formal logbooks with careful notations of coordinates and catches. Others were more personal, containing observations about changing ocean conditions, folk remedies for common ailments at sea, and occasionally reflections on the precarious balance between making a living and staying alive. "The Historical Society will want these," Jack noted, carefully turning the brittle pages of a particularly old volume. Real treasure trove of local knowledge here. Flora agreed to donate most of the materials to the Montauk Maritime Museum, but as she and Jack catalogued the collection, they made a startling discovery: a journal with D. Murphy inscribed on its leather cover. Unlike the older logbooks, this volume was relatively new, dating only to the year before David's death. "Didn't know he kept a traditional journal," Jack said, surprised. "He was all digital with the boat records, used that fancy fishing app on his phone." Flora's hands trembled slightly as she opened the book that night at her kitchen table, long after Nanette had gone to bed. The familiar handwriting elicited a physical ache, a momentary reopening of grief's wound that had begun to scar over with time. The journal wasn't a fishing log at all, but rather a collection of ideas, sketches, and plans centered around the Little Stone Bakery. David had been secretly designing an expansion concept, researching equipment, and calculating potential costs, all without ever mentioning these efforts to Flora. Flora's 5-year plan, one page was titled, featuring a detailed sketch of an expanded bakery layout with a cafe section, display kitchen, and separate production area. The margins contained notes about preserving the building's historic character while modernizing its functionality. Exactly the balance Flora had been trying to strike in her current renovation plans. Another section outlined potential financing options, including the note that had brought tears to Flora's eyes when Jack first revealed it years earlier. Boat sale to B&L Fishing Corp., $42,500, enough for down payment and initial renovations. Most moving were the personal notes scattered throughout the practical plans. "F deserves a space as exceptional as her talent," David had written beside a particularly detailed sketch of a custom display case. "She could build something really special here with the right support." The discovery of David's journal transformed the expansion project from a practical business decision into something far more meaningful. Working with the architect, Flora incorporated elements of David's design into the final plans, not just out of sentiment, but because his ideas were genuinely thoughtful and aligned with her own vision. The expanded bakery opened in November, just in time for the holiday rush. The renovation had preserved both buildings' historic facades while creating a spacious interior that flowed logically from retail space to cafe seating to a partially visible production kitchen where customers could watch specialty items being crafted. A central feature was the heritage display, a custom case designed according to David's sketches, showcasing the story of the Murphy family recipes alongside artifacts from the discovered cellar. A portion of David's journal was displayed open to a page featuring his bakery expansion sketch, protected under glass but visible to customers who were often moved by this tangible evidence of a husband's belief in his wife's talent. For the opening celebration, Flora created a new pastry that symbolized this unexpected connection across time and loss. Called the Dreamer, it featured layers of meaning along with its layers of flavor, a foundation of traditional shortbread supporting innovative combinations of local fruit, spices, and a delicate sugar sculpture reminiscent of a fishing boat's sail. "He saw who you could become even before you did," Ursula observed quietly as they stood together at the opening, watching Nanette proudly showing off her bakery to anyone who would listen. "That's the rarest kind of love, the kind that sees beyond the present moment." Flora nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle into her heart. David's journal had revealed that he had shared her dreams more completely than she had ever known, had been actively working to help her achieve them, even while maintaining his own family traditions. The expansion wasn't just building on the foundation he had left behind. It was in some mysterious way a collaboration that transcended his absence. As the third anniversary of her loss approaches, Flora completes the expansion following those sketches, creating a space that beautifully merges maritime traditions with modern culinary arts. At the grand opening, standing confidently with Nanette by her side, Flora realizes that she has not just survived, but transformed her pain into something beautiful that honors the love that will always be part of her life. The legacy she's building will ensure their daughter grows up knowing that even the deepest grief can be navigated with courage, creativity, and the willingness to accept love in its new and unexpected forms. The third anniversary of David's death fell on a Tuesday in early February, a quiet, ordinary day in the middle of Montauk's off-season. In previous years, Flora had marked the date by closing the bakery and spending the day in private reflection, often walking the shoreline where she felt closest to David, or sitting by Nanette's bedside, telling stories about the father her daughter would never remember firsthand. This year felt different. As the date approached, Flora realized she didn't want to close the thriving business or retreat from the community that had become such an integral part of her healing. Instead, she decided to mark the anniversary by completing the final element of the expansion, the installation of a memorial window David had sketched in his journal, featuring stained glass elements that would cast the colors of ocean and sky across the cafe space at different times of day. The artisan Flora had commissioned to create the window worked through the night to complete the installation before opening. When Flora arrived at dawn to begin the day's baking, she found the morning sun streaming through the new glass, painting the wooden floors and white walls with gentle blues and greens that seemed to move like the surface of the sea. "It's exactly how he drew it," she whispered to herself, remembering the detailed sketch in David's journal with its margin note. Light changes throughout the day, like the water itself. He had understood something essential about both the physical space and about Flora herself. That beauty could be found in constant change, in the way light and shadow shifted with time's passage. The day unfolded with its usual rhythms: morning rush, midday lull, afternoon uptick as schools released and people stopped for coffee and a sweet bite. Flora moved through these familiar patterns with a sense of peace that would have seemed impossible in the early days of her grief. The bakery hummed with purposeful activity. Staff members who had become like family worked efficiently in the expanded kitchen. Regular customers chatted comfortably in the new cafe space where the memorial window cast its ever-changing light. Ursula arrived in the afternoon with Nanette, who had spent the morning at her grandmother's house, learning to make traditional fishing net floats from cork and twine, a craft project that bridged generations and honored David's heritage. The little girl proudly displayed her creation to the kitchen staff before settling at her special corner table with crayons and a pastry chef's notebook, earnestly copying the shapes of cookies and bread loaves with remarkable attention to detail, for a child not yet 3. "She has your eye for form," Ursula observed, watching her granddaughter's concentrated efforts. And David's stubbornness about getting things exactly right. The observation brought a smile to Flora's face, rather than the pang it might once have caused. Nanette was indeed a beautiful blend of both her parents, David's coloring and adventurous spirit wrapped around Flora's gentle patience and creative instincts. The little girl was developing her own distinct personality as well, with a natural sociability that had made her a favorite among bakery customers and fishing crews alike. As closing time approached, Gabriel arrived unexpectedly, having adjusted his consulting schedule to be in Montauk for this significant date. He carried a small package wrapped in blue paper, the exact shade of the bakery's door. "I remembered what day it was," he said simply, his friendship with Flora having deepened enough over the years that elaborate explanations were unnecessary. "Thought you might appreciate some company." The gift was a custom rubber stamp featuring an artistic rendering of the Mariner's Lady in its current incarnation as a floating cafe. "For your packaging," Gabriel explained, "connects all aspects of your brand story. The thoughtful present, practical yet meaningful, honoring the past while focused on future growth, epitomized the understanding that had developed between them. What had begun as a professional relationship had evolved into a friendship based on mutual respect and genuine care, though neither had pushed for it to become anything more. Both seemed to recognize that Flora's heart was still finding its new shape, and that rushing emotional healing would serve neither of them well. After closing, Flora invited Gabriel, Ursula, Jack, and a few other close friends to join her and Nanette for a small gathering at the floating cafe. As they crossed the harbor boardwalk in the fading winter light, Nanette skipping ahead with childish excitement, Flora found herself struck by the contrast between this moment and the dark despair of 3 years earlier. The Mariner's Lady glowed, with warm light against the deepening blue of evening, the boat's gentle rocking on the harbor waters a familiar comfort rather than a painful reminder. Inside, Flora had prepared a simple meal featuring recipes from David's grandmother's collection, alongside her own innovations, a culinary representation of the bridge she had built between tradition and creation. As their small group shared food and memories, the conversation flowed naturally between past and present, sorrow and joy, loss and discovery. Jack Murphy told stories of David's early days on the boat. Ursula shared childhood anecdotes that made Nanette giggle. Friends from the village recounted the community's response to the flood and the subsequent rebuilding. Through it all, Flora felt David's presence not as a painful absence but as a foundation upon which something new and beautiful had been constructed. When the meal concluded, Flora slipped away briefly to the boat's stern, needing a moment alone with the harbor night. The February air was crisp and clear, stars scattered abundantly across the dark sky, their reflection dancing on the water's surface. She traced the familiar constellations, the same stars that had guided fishermen home for generations, that had watched over David on his final voyage, that now witnessed her continued journey. "I think you'd be proud," she whispered, not to the stars but to the memory that lived within her, not just of the business, but of who we've become without you. Nanette is amazing, so much of you in her, and I—" She paused, considering. "I found strength I never knew I had. I wish you could see what I built from what we lost." The cool breeze against her face felt almost like a caress, and Flora allowed herself to imagine just for a moment that David somehow knew that he had witnessed her transformation from broken widow to confident creator of her own destiny. The thought brought comfort rather than pain, a sense of his approval washing over her like the gentle harbor tide. When she returned to the warmth of the cafe's interior, Nanette ran to meet her, wrapping small arms around Flora's legs. "Mommy! Uncle Jack says I can go on his boat when I'm bigger." Flora lifted her daughter, marveling at how substantial she had become, no longer the helpless infant who had been her sole reason for continuing in those darkest days. "Is that so? And what will you do on Uncle Jack's boat?" "Learn the fish places," Nanette declared, with the seriousness only a toddler could muster. And then make special cookies for the fishermen, like you and Grandma Murphy. The simple statement captured everything Flora had hoped to build, a child connected to her heritage, yet free to create her own path, understanding that traditions could be honored through innovation rather than mere repetition. Nanette was growing up neither in the shadow of tragedy nor in ignorance of it, but with the knowledge that loss could be transformed through love and creativity into something that nourished both self and community. As the small celebration continued around her, Flora felt a profound sense of accomplishment that went far beyond business success. She had not just survived widowhood, she had refused to be defined by it. The bakery, the floating cafe, the scholarship fund, the community she had helped rebuild after the flood, these were not compensations for what she had lost, but creations that would never have existed without the journey grief had forced her to undertake. Looking around at the gathered faces, Ursula, now a beloved grandmother rather than an adversary, Jack, who had moved from blame to respect to friendship, Gabriel, whose professional guidance had become personal support, the village friends, who had judged her mourning choices, but now celebrated her strength. Flora recognized that she had built more than a business. She had created a bridge between past and future, tradition and innovation, loss and possibility. Outside, the winter stars continued their ancient patterns above the harbor, where fishing boats and pleasure craft rocked side by side in the protected waters. Inside, warmed by food and friendship, Flora Murphy held her daughter close and silently, thanked the man whose love had given her both this child and the courage to rebuild when that love was taken away. The legacy she was creating would ensure that Nanette grew up understanding the most important lesson Flora had learned through her grief, that even the deepest wounds could be transformed into something beautiful through courage, creativity, and the willingness to accept love in its new and unexpected forms, not as replacement for what was lost, but as honor to its memory and testimony to the resilience of the human heart. Congratulations. Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.